Today's speakers will be Major General Stephen Shapiro, Commanding General, U.S. Army Sustainment Command; Major General Stephen Farmen, Commanding General, Surface Deployment and Distribution Command; Mr. Matthew Senito, SES, Executive Director for Support Operations, U.S. Army Sustainment Command. During the question and answer section, please wait till you have the mic so that everyone may hear your question. At this time, let's welcome the first speaker, Major General Shapiro.
Thank you. So first I want to just give a little bit more of an introduction, and we'll go ahead and do that. Then we'll get into a couple of slides, and then certainly take any questions or comments from the audience. So Major General Steve Shapiro, I can no longer say the new commander of Army Sustainment Command, but been in Army Sustainment Command for about 2 months now, came in from Germany out of the 21st TSC. Army Sustainment Command based out of Rock Island, Illinois. We have command and control over 7 brigades, the AFSBs, and they are both in CONUS and OCONUS. And we also run 70 plus LRCs in support of IMCOM at the garrisons in support of power projection, the Army's power projection mission. So that is our mission as it pertains to force projection when it comes to Army Sustainment Command. I'll turn it over to Steve Farmen, tell you a little bit about, Matt Senito first, about what he does at ASC.
Yes, hello, Matt Senito, Army Sustainment Command. I work for General Shapiro. Within the portfolio, as he indicated, we've got 78 LRCs for the power projection capability, also to include the Army preposition stocks that are in the Army's inventory that we also consider that key capability that helps us project the force for either the plans that we're looking at, the 50 series, the 40 series plans, as another strategic capability that the Army can leverage.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So, good morning, good afternoon. Steve Farmen, I command Surface Deployment Distribution Command. What is that? So that is the Army Service Component Command of U.S. Transcom. So we are the Army component of U.S. Transportation Command. I think everybody understands what that command does. It projects forces and sustains forces at great distances. We're a global organization, so we're Army component of U.S. Transcom and also a major subordinate command of Army Materiel Command. So I answer to General Perna on the Army side and General Lyons on the Transcom side. I have another chart coming up a little bit later that'll get in a little bit more detail that I think is important for our portion of what we're going to talk about today, so you have another layer of who we are and what we do. But think of it this way. We script the alignment and flow of forces from the post-camp station to the port, onto the vessel, which is a surface, so again, surface, conveyance, and then we work with the Theater Sustainment Command on the other end to script the flow of forces into the tactical assembly area. So I'll just leave it at that for now, and then we'll come back. Actually, I got another stage set chart I want to give you right now. Next. So I think you've already seen some press. I know I've picked up on some press already, and you'll hear more about this from our new Chief of Staff of the Army, but the fact of the matter is, with the new National Defense Strategy and dynamic force employment, you're going to hear the Chief talk about tactical readiness, which is our ability at the tactical level to fight tonight. You know, if your T rating and C rating is where it needs to be, you're tactically ready to go. But are you strategically ready? And what we think about, and certainly what we're going to talk to you about today, is to be strategically ready. Your unit, if you're a unit and you're ready to go at Fort Hood, you have to be strategically ready to project yourself to wherever you may need to go in support of global operations. And we don't know what that's going to be, because we're in the boxer stance. We don't know where the enemy's going to come from, so your ability to be ready at Fort Hood and go to wherever the Department of Defense needs you, that's strategic readiness. Being very, very good at what it says there, from setting the theater. I think a question I could throw out to the group right now would be, are we in the right boxer stance right now globally to be able to react and be agile and adaptive enough? And I know between Army Sustainment Command and Surface Deployment Distribution Command, we pitch and catch a lot to ensure that we are setting the globe to be ready to execute dynamic force employment in accordance with the National Defense Strategy. So again, what this shows you, those gears, the key takeaway here is force projection is strategic readiness. Think about that. Tactically ready, but if you can force project, that is strategic readiness. And that's where the Army is moving towards in the future, and that's why we want to talk about this today. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to General Shapiro, and he's going to talk about his piece of the puzzle.
Can you go to the next slide, please? And so, you know, we've got to think about what we mean by strategic readiness. And so really right now we're talking about, and Steve really talks about dynamic force employment, getting the force to where it needs to be. But inside the law community, we also talk about the dynamic employment of sustainment. And so we've got to put, you know, so getting a brigade to go to where it's got to go, but if it's only got its basic load when it gets there, in about 3 or 4 days, it culminates. So General Perna has told us, directed us, take a look at the strategic support area. Those things that happen in CONUS, those things that happen between the industrial base and the core rear boundary. And we've got to get that right so that that brigade has a level of operational reach to do what it is the COCOM commander needs them to do. So if you look across the top, and I won't talk about all of those, but installation readiness. Are the railheads at Fort Hood, Fort Campbell, Fort Bragg, are they ready to project that force to their port to get them on a ship that Steve will have ready? Munitions readiness. Do we have the right munitions with that unit in CONUS so that that unit can grab its munitions that it needs to deploy in? And then, are the munitions on the far end, you pick a theater, are the munitions on the far end available for that brigade to pick up its up to 2 more basic loads and move to the TAA or meet it at the TAA? So right now, the strategic support area, the reach into the joint security area, is a big deal in AMC. So it's not just about the brigade getting to where it's got to go. It's setting the theater. It's the dynamic employment of sustainment that we have got to think our way through so that that unit has a level of staying power. So just when we talk about readiness in the Army, we tend to talk about the C rating, the PSR&T. And so I think the chief said this morning, or the secretary said this morning, we have elevated the readiness of our brigade combat teams twice of what it was. I think about 2/3 are now C1 or C2. That's a huge accomplishment for the United States Army. But now what's the focus? Strategic readiness. And so I'll turn to Matt to talk a little bit about facilities and positioning commodities in CONUS, and I'll talk a little bit about the industrial base. Matt?
Yeah. So as we looked at the strategy of the Army change, looking at the NDS, going to the near peer competitor type mindset in MDO, we started taking a concentrated look at how to project the force, not from a BCT standpoint, but multiple divisions simultaneously across our footprint here in the strategic support area. So working with our partners, FORCECOM, the Guard, the Reserves, TRADOC, to understand their force flow and the requirements and the capabilities of the types of forces that are going to be projected from any one of the power projection platforms out there or at the MFGI locations. We have worked to determine the requirements for a period of time and have made the investment in our infrastructure. Still more work to be done, but talking about railheads for the first time, looking at brake test machines, ADR, equipment, these capabilities that don't get a lot of visibility from day-to-day operations, but are so critical for the Army to project the forces. And so over the last 18 months, we have made a concerted effort to make an investment in our infrastructure. The same thing with various commodities out there. We have put a set of stocks at each of these PPPs and MFGIs in terms of EQUITs, J-lists, ESAPI plates, Class 5 TAT ammunition based, again, on the type of the unit that's going to be going into these different theaters. Again, so that, the force has got the capability to project itself in a no-notice type situation. We focus on then the fort, as we call it, and then with our partnership with General Farmen's team, really moving then the unit to the port. So I'll turn it back over to General Shapiro. To General Farmen.
Okay. Hey, Marv, all right, thanks, Matt. So what I'm going to touch on now is the middle bucket right here, which is projection. So that's where we come in at U.S. Transportation Command. If you look up at the top here, these strategic support areas, you see munitions readiness, and strategic power projection. Those are the main buckets that we touch to bridge the material enterprise to the joint deployment distribution enterprise. So let me go to the next chart real quick, and then I'm going to come back to this, because I just want to give you a little bit of layer more on SDDC so you understand the integration and synchronization required in CONUS with our teammates up here in order to get to the projection piece that we're talking about. So SDDC, we move, our purpose, the reason we exist, is to move, deploy, and sustain the armed forces to deliver readiness and lethality at speed. That is the whole reason we exist, and it's up there on that chart. Move, deploy, and sustain the armed forces. So doing that, in the middle box that you see popped out, we have these 8 readiness levels.
Our greatest strength is our people.
In order to allow for this projection to happen,
been,
we have to integrate and synchronize these levers with our commercial carriers and industry partners. So let me just touch on one of these, or all 8 of these, very, very rapidly. The trucks, we have over 800 truck companies that we work with, 1 million trucks that we can touch and tap into in order to project the force. Total force integration is the reserve component. The depth in our formation is the 2,700 MTO soldiers that we use even today to keep pace with the level of scale of movements that we're doing right now. And then there's rail. This is an interesting data point. Rail would be our version of planes and ships if you thought of the Army component. So 70% of the Army, if it's going to deploy at scale, is going to go from a post-camp station to a seaport by rail. That's a big number. So our ability to work with all the Class 1 railroads in CONUS in order to do that is really, really important. And then ammunition. We own the 2 crown jewels. Matsu, Military Ocean Terminal, Sunny Point on the East Coast, and Military Ocean Terminal, Concord on the West Coast. Those 2 crown jewels distribute ammunition globally, all over the world. Nothing else can touch them anywhere. We do analysis, so Transportation Engineering Agency, flow analysis, port analysis, all those things to make sure things are transportation feasible. Containers, we are the global container managers for the globe. And so we work with Army Sustainment Command to make sure that we have the funding we need to make sure that think of it this way, the Army moves on 20-foot containers, the world moves on 20-foot containers. We got to make sure we have that projection capability. And then ships, we touch the gray bottom ships, and then we touch our commercial carriers and partners through our contracting process, and they are the conveyance, node-to-node conveyance that we use. And then the big takeaway on the biggest lever we have is the seaports. And why is that important? Is those are the nodes. And it's the nodes in the network that you see on this chart, the connectors that are the strength and power of U.S. Transcom. And that's where we live at the Army component. We live at those nodes. I always tell the team, if we go to war, we're going to fight by, with, and through the ports. If we go to war, we're fighting by, with, and through the ports. So our ability to get things from the power projection platform to those nodes and project it over, that's what we do working with the Army, is script the alignment and flow of forces to be able to do that. And then the relevance thing, just to touch on this, we're doing 80 brigade combat team moves a year. That's pretty significant. So when we talk about going out of counterinsurgency and into high-end scale operations, that's why we're on the stage here today, that's why that is important, and we got to be in the right boxer stance to react to that. Okay. If you could go forward, and then forward again, I'm going to touch on a couple things in the project thing. So what are we doing to enable things to happen and expand the competitive space to enable the national defense strategy to happen? Well, global port diversification is one thing. Working with General Shapiro and his team, but more importantly our Army, what we're doing is pressure testing all the ports on our coasts, East Coast, Gulf Coast, West Coast, test firing our strategic ports and our alternate ports to make sure we know how they're going to work, where the vulnerabilities are, where's the risk, so that we can flow high-end forces through there. And we're doing the same thing in Europe, where General Shapiro just was. We're doing it in the Middle East, and we're doing it in the Pacific. So this is expanding the competitive space, making sure that we don't always go through the normal seaports, but we have options, and we keep the enemy guessing. Ammo port upgrades, we're putting a new pier out on the West Coast, so we're going to have increased capability to push ammunition off the West Coast, and we continue to get great funding and support in MILCON on both East and West Coast, and in the Northwest at Naval Magazine Indian Island to project lethality all over the world. Speed of war moves. We just did a speed of war move to Europe, where General Shapiro just was. 2-1 Cav just went from Fort Hood to the Port of Jacksonville to Europe. It's happening right now as we speak. I just got an update this morning. The intent was to do it in 44 days. We think we're going to get it in around 40. There is a chance it might be in 38 to 40 range. So we're testing these ports, and we're also putting a metric on it to make sure we can get it done in that speed. So that is a very powerful test, but we're having to get a lot of muscle memory back in our documentation, because speed is the guiding organizational principle for our organization and everything we do. If you want to move at the speed of war, you got to move at the speed of documentation. Unfortunately, that's admin, but that's how it works. And then last but not least, it's just a reserve component. We could not do this without them. We're certainly going to need them at a high end, but right now, with the volume, tempo, and complexity of the moves that we're doing right now, we have to tap into them. And we're doing it at a very high clip. And we have some other things we can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested on other things we're doing on the projection space. And at this point, the handoff, the baton toss to General Shapiro over in Europe is what's important now.
And so here we are. You know, we've got units that are C1 and C2, they're ready to go. We've got the commodities, they've got their basic load, they've got their TAT to go with them. They're coming out of more modern facilities, and that's working through MILCON and SRM to get them ready to meet those hacks that Steve talked about. And the entire industrial base, whether it's ammunition, Class 9, but the industrial base is behind this. So it's a level of strategic readiness that we have not articulated before and asked for before. They've got to the ports. Steve and SDDC with Transcom have moved them to the ports of debarkation, and I use Europe as the model because I made the slide and I came from Europe, so that's how we did. That's how it goes, I guess. And right now, there could be a brigade that comes in without its equipment. That'll go to the APS, and one of the things that we're working, not just APS readiness, but APS readiness for the fight. And so we've been working on something for a few years now called Configured for Combat. You know, a soldier was fighting an M1 tank in Iraq at the height of the insurgency, and that tank had everything on it that was given by PMs and PEOs, all the bells and whistles that were developed over the years. And when they went back to home station, that equipment followed them, but the APS never modernized. And so we had this giant TAT requirement. If you're going to come from Fort Hood or Fort Bliss and fall in on this APS brigade, you've got to strip all that stuff out of your tanks and come with us. I think the TAT requirement was some astronomical number of containers or C-17s. So right now we've got funded for 20 and 21 to buy those things that were normally TAT and make those APS sets configured for combat. So a soldier leaves Fort Bliss or Fort Hood, he'll fall in a piece of equipment that looks just like the one he left. And we've gotten a little bit away from that. We're going to get back to that. We're redesigning our contracts. We're entering a period of log cap 5, where we're integrating our log cap on our vendors at the TS and secret level planning perspective into the ASCC and TSC op plan writing. So right now we're modifying our contracts, and really, I learned this from General Becky Halstead years ago, making sure those contractors that are in our formation are on our line and block charts. We're going to make sure so it'll go to a level of COR development that we haven't had in a while. Aegis and exercises, we'll talk tomorrow at the USRO panel on Defender. But right now, between Aegis and exercises, we're practicing the speed of war. We're practicing dynamic force employment, 80 brigades a year for the last 3 or 4 years to a volume we haven't seen in a very long time. And they're going with their equipment. For OIF and OEF, we were moving brigades around the planet, but they were falling in on the old TPE account. Now soldiers are learning how to, those skills that are not in their manuals. They're learning how to tie down tanks. They're learning how to convoy across the continent. That's a level of readiness that they don't get sitting on their installation. And right now, and General Perna will talk about this whenever you give him the opportunity, he's looking at the strategic support area. He's getting the entire defense industrial base, and he's laser focusing them on getting that effect from the industrial base at the tactical point of need. So he does not want to reach in to the core rear boundary and do anything, but he wants to provide the effect so that a TSC commander or a corps commander can grab that strategic effect and affect an outcome on the battlefield, and it'll happen back at AMC months in advance, whether it's a purchase or a contract rewrite, and we'll have that effect forward. And so that's kind of where we're going in this. I think that's our last slide. I'll leave that up there, but we are happy to take any questions or take any commentary, any redirection for anybody out there who wishes to do so. I think we have a person with a mic. I'll open it up to the floor.
Given the new emphasis on great power conflict and the fact that the homeland may no longer be a safe area, how are you factoring that into all of this?
So from a port standpoint, in terms of that, CONUS no longer a sanctuary and those types of things, we are partnering in with DHS, all the local, what we do is we have these things called port readiness committees, and we put more wind in those sails. We're starting to invigorate that. So I have battalion commanders, brigade commanders that are on the edges that lead and run all these different ports. And they inject themselves into these port readiness committees. We partner with the Coast Guard. And by doing that, we've done things like cyber TTXs. We look at the threat and we triangulate, how we're all going to play in that sandbox if something happened at this particular node. So we actually are working very, very hard to get out in front of that threat, specifically on cyber. But we're also looking at it from a multi-layered thing, whether it's in sleeper cells and insider threats, because every piece even in the continental United States, East, Gulf Coast, West Coast, all has different dynamics. It's one of those things, you've seen a port, you've seen a port. They all have their own dynamics to it. So I think through these port readiness committees, we are bringing all the agencies together to deal with the threat at all these different nodes.
And so from my perspective, if you go back 20 years before 9/11, the Army had a lot of redundancy built into its logistics. And so there were multiple stockpiles. And frankly, right now, and I'm not trying to say that was bad, I think that's as smart as we were at the time, and we've learned a little bit since then. We don't talk about redundancy anymore, but we do talk about resiliency. And so you've got to have resilient plans. So I think in CONUS, we didn't put everything that you need to deploy in one location. There are multiple locations throughout CONUS, and you'll see that OCONUS, we are flattening out our storage capacity and capability. So there's a cyber perspective, but I'm not sure you're going to get it all. And there's an A2AD perspective. I'm not sure you're going to get it all. So flattening out your footprint and having resiliency in your plan. If you lose a rail line, there's 3 or 4 more rail lines. If you lose a route, there's 3 or 4 more routes. And so resiliency in our plan, thinking through, which I think we haven't done a lot from a log perspective, operationally and strategically before, what are your branches and sequels? There's a lot of thought being put into branches and sequels on things that we do now that I think we didn't do for 18 years because it was get on a plane, go in, full on that equipment, go back, and a year and a half later, you're back at the same fob because your brigade has a habit of going to that fob. So it's the resiliency in our plans, I think, that you'll see at the strategic and operational level that's new in the last 18 years.
I'd like to add another layer to that answer too, and you heard me talk about port diversification. So with the volume, tempo, and complexity that we're moving out and we're test firing and pressure testing multiple ports, what does that do? That means more port readiness committee meetings, more people figuring out how to identify vulnerabilities and risks. Great example, the speed of war move we've just been talking about went through the port from Fort Hood through Jacksonville Port. We haven't moved an Armor Brigade combat team through that port in over a decade. So think of what that did in terms of bringing all the team of teams together to think through the threats that you're talking about. So by using this diversification in our ports, both OCONUS and CONUS, I think we're starting to chip away at that and we're bringing the right team of teams together to get after it.
Gentlemen, in regards to the strategic readiness, has there been metrics developed to articulate the ability to project power in terms of dynamic force employment?
No, I think my first stab at it, and I'll toss it to General Shapiro, is I think we're at the tip of the iceberg on that, and the Army is trying to gain rapidly on that target. We haven't got the answer yet. Speed of war moves, you heard me say, hey, can you do it in 42 days, 44 days? That could become a metric, but I think the Army staff and everybody else is looking very, very hard at strategic readiness and how do we want to measure that? What's the right way to get after that? I think we all kind of see some areas, but it hasn't been codified yet.
And what I will say is, and I'll agree with that, maybe taking a step further, I'm going to say yes, but. I think yes, we do from a CSS perspective. I think when we look at the op plans that we think we have to go with, whether we may have to do execution in the Pacific or in the European theater, we understand what the numbers look like. And so we're going to put those stocks forward, and are we red, green, or amber on stocks? Do we have it? Do we not have it? I think we're working that right now. From a power projection platform perspective, we have baseball cards down to the nth level of detail. So we've got the metrics. They are mostly AMC internal metrics. I think as the ability to measure the Army's ability to do its job is not a CSS task. So AMC has taken this on from the strategic support area perspective. And we see ourselves very well, and we see the Army well. What we've got to do is have a conversation with the Army as the Army further develops its metrics for strategic readiness. How do we incorporate ourselves as logisticians into that discussion? I think that's where the work is starting now, and that's where I think the Army's going, and AMC will certainly let them see what we've done and make sure that what we're measuring
in a complex world,
matches their
our
requirements.
greatest strength is our people. Always
Had
has
another
been,
quick thought to that. I know
always
on the
will be.
Transcom side, we know the math,
Regular
and we know
Army,
the physics,
National
right?
Guard,
In terms of
and
being able to
Army
move
Reserve.
things at a big clip, but a big
Executing
metric
every
is going to
mission,
be there's a BCT
preparing
brigade
for
combat
everything.
team. You know, the dimensional
that's
data
why
being accurate,
people
making
matter.
sure that all
Every
the
soldier,
documentation
every
type
Army
things that
civilian,
really are the
every
things that
Army
gum
family,
up the process.
every soldier
We have to keep
for
the
life.
community where it needs to be.
Every
How do we
one of
measure
us.
that level of readiness?
People who make up the best
command
equipped,
deployment discipline
best
type
trained,
things
best
down and
led
in the
force
unit
in the world.
will transcend into some strategical metrics.
People who serve
But I agree with
something
everything
greater than
General Shapiro
themselves.
said as well. I mean, I think we all have
Ready
a lot
now,
of good metrics to chase.
investing in the
It's just
future
how are we gonna look at it
across
from
every domain.
Yeah.
Because in today's complex world, when the stakes are high, America calls its
Question for
Army.
you on the RC
And
comments
when
you
that
made
call
earlier.
comes,
Within
second
SDC
place
currently,
is not an option.
What's your current numbers?
We'll
in
remain
terms of
ready.
RC units and
We'll
people
modernize.
are mobilized.
We'll
Have
compete.
been oriented towards specific
We'll
strategic
fight.
supports for additional,
And we
benefits,
will
and,
win.
what's the current status of readiness
Because
of these
winning
units and your accessibility
matters.
to them when you need them?
Yeah,
Winning
no, thanks for that
matters.
question.
Yes, it
so,
does.
luckily, I think the Deployment Support Command, which is the
Hey, good afternoon and
2,700
welcome to
soldiers
all,
that we
and
have,
special thanks
is the
to
poster
General
child
Carter
for
Ham
goodness
and your team
in terms of a
put
relationship
together
between
another
our command. They're
fabulous
OPCON to
AUSA event.
SDDC, so they
Today
wear the
is a
same
great
patch
day
I
to
wear.
be in the United
And there's
States
not a lot of
Army.
relationships
And
with
I'm
our
truly
reserve
honored
component and
to
active
serve
component that
as
have
the
it that
40th
way.
Chief of Staff.
There's
I'm extremely
5
excited
brigades,
about the
12
Army
battalions,
leadership
and a lot of
team we have in
alphabet
place,
soup in that
led by a
2,700
great
that
secretary,
allow
Brian
us
McCarthy,
to project
and supported
forces
by a super
globally
team
and be
of
able to
the
do that
Honorable
at a
Jimmy
high level.
Fasson,
You
Son
heard,
Major of the Army
if you were at the
Totally
Guard
Princeton,
Reserve
Vice
breakfast,
Chief of
General
Staff
Lucky
of the
talked
Army,
about Ready
Joe
Force
Martin,
X,
and Director of the
and
Army
you know,
Staff, Walt
certain
Pike.
layer of
I
reservists
couldn't
being at
ask
a
for
different
better
level of
teammates.
readiness. Our Deployment
I
Support
know we
Command
have several
soldiers are in
former
that
chiefs and
layer
vices here,
of readiness.
as well as
So
quite a few other
we get a
general
lot of
officers,
bang out of that,
sergeant
you know, in
majors.
terms of using them.
Thank
I call
you
them
for
the secret
being
sauce.
here.
I mean, we absolutely,
generation
with our,
has
just our
its
active
heroes.
forces,
We
without
have two
them
of them with
and
us
having their
today.
readiness level where it
Medal
is with the
honor
Ready Force X,
recipients, Master
we would
Sergeant
not be able to
Leroy
even keep
Petrie
pace with what we're
from
trying to do
Afghanistan,
today, much
and
less,
Staff
I
Sergeant
think, at
David
scale.
Bellavia from
Right now,
Iraq.
we're tapping into
Could
our
you
reserve
please
component
stand
by
so we can honor your
38%,
presence?
you know, out of the 2,700 to keep pace. And we project that out over 18 to 24 months, and we're even looking out 5 years with our reserve component to make sure that we can maintain the pace with this Defender
I would like to
series that you're hearing
recognize
about, which is Europe
our
and then
remarkable
Pacific,
warriors.
Europe and then
You inspire
Pacific.
us.
So this is like a
And our Gold
10-year
Star family
horizon
members,
that we're
thank
talking
you.
about, where we're going to be
Your
getting
loved
after this
ones gave
deployment
all,
force
and we will never
projection
forget
and getting
their
after strategic
sacrifice
readiness.
are yours.
So that
I know we also
we're
have
in
some of our
we're in a really
congressional
good
staff
fighting
members in the room.
stance. My
We
personal
really
assessment
appreciate you being
with
here
our reserve
and all the
component, we're
work
getting a
you're
lot of
doing
reps.
to get us the
We're
resources
getting a heck of a lot of
we
reps.
need to be ready
You know,
now
80
and
brigade
in the
combat
future.
teams a year,
But if you need to leave
BCTs,
early to
BCT
finish that
minus.
bill,
That's
I'm
a
not
lot of
hurt my
repetitions
feelings.
through a lot of ports and a lot of learning and a lot
And
of
I'm
getting better at
pleased to have
strategic
so many of our
readiness.
allies and partners here.
I hope that answers
Thank
the
you
question.
for coming. We never want to fight alone, and we are stronger working together, shoulder to shoulder, promoting security and stability around
I think that's
the
it.
world.
So, again, we'll
As
stay
I
up here
said
for a few
earlier,
more
it's
minutes
an
if
incredible
you have some
honor
questions you
to
want to
be
come
here
up and
as
talk
the
about,
Chief
or
of
some
Staff
commentary.
of the Army.
But thank you for your
I'm wearing
time,
the new
and
Army
we look
Green
forward to seeing you
service
on the
uniform
floor.
today.
Thank you.
So what do you think?